Thanks, Marie, for that introduction, and also for inviting me here, for having me to the Danforth Center, to Washington University, to St. Louis, where I've never been, and I'm really excited to be here and to getting to know WashU and also the city. I also want to thank Lee Schmidt for being such a good host today and for a great class with some of his grad students. And to Lenora Fisher and Deborah Kennard for their help in organizing everything and putting it together and making me feel so welcome here. And I'm really looking forward, even though I'm not sure what's going to be coming, to Liz Borgwart's commentary. As Marie said, Liz is, I'm buttering her up here for hopefully some soft treatment in her commentary, but she's a very distinguished name. She's a very distinguished person in my field and in a lot of fields of American history, and so it's a real honor to have her give a commentary and feedback, and to have read some of my book. I'd like to begin by explaining my book, its premises, and some of its major arguments, and to trace some of the arguments in very general outline, and then to give some specific examples to demonstrate what I mean. The book, Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, traces the religious influence on American foreign relations from the late 16th century up to the very recent past. The last chapter deals with Ronald Reagan and the end of the Cold War, but I do have a brief epilogue that looks at George W. Bush and Barack Obama. The main purpose of the book is to trace the historical evolution of the relationship between American religion and U.S. foreign relations, which I see as a very deep, very profound, but mostly ignored relationship in the scholarly literature. It was ignored, that is, until 9/11, which generated an immense amount of interest in the role of religion in international relations. 9/11, and especially the dueling religious rhetoric of George W. Bush and Osama bin Laden, and others too, including British Prime Minister Tony Blair, gave the role of religion in international relations a lot of attention. But much of this attention was either episodic. There was some outstanding scholarship that had looked at very specific aspects of religion and world politics, or religion and American foreign policy, so it wasn't systematic or comprehensive or synthetic. Or this literature was concerned with current affairs, or with what was then current affairs immediately after 9/11 and in the run-up to the Iraq War. And as a consequence, this literature on religion and international relations was mostly highly political, often highly polemical, and sensationalistic. And some of it's quite good, but a lot of it is very much a product of its time. Books that focus on Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, or on the religious right, and American support for Israel. In fact, when I began the book in 2003, I had as a working title Holy Warriors. And I ended up dropping that title for a variety of reasons, most importantly because it didn't fit with the main thesis of the book as I began to write it, and I realized that later. But also because after 9/11, the title Holy Warriors was taken up by about a dozen other books, most of them on post-9/11 world politics, some of it on U.S. foreign policy after 9/11. And interestingly, actually, some of it on the Crusades, some of the new literature on Crusades history that, for a variety of reasons that we could discuss in the discussion section, also brings religion back into the historiography of the Crusades. And a lot of these books used either the phrase Holy War or Holy Warriors. And so I ended up dropping that title. By the same token, religious historians hadn't paid much attention to the links between religion and foreign relations. There was a lot of extremely good work on specific aspects of how war and diplomatic crises affected American religion, but there wasn't a whole lot by religious historians on how religion influenced U.S. foreign policy. And so what we had were two very large, very diverse, and very interesting bodies of historiography in American diplomatic history and American religious history that essentially weren't speaking to one another, or when they were speaking to one another, it was on very specific issues here and there. This is where my book comes in, and it's why I've attempted to trace the roots of this relationship back to the colonial era and carry it up right through to the present. So I see the influence of religion on U.S. foreign policy as a consistent influence that wasn't determined simply by having a very religious person sitting in the White House, It was much more consistent. It was much broader than simply one person like a George W. Bush, and that this influence ebbed and flowed over time. It wasn't always determining. It didn't always push American foreign policy in the same direction, but it was always there. The first 5 chapters of the book deal with the period up to 1791, from English Protestant ideas about religion, security, and empire beginning in the 1570s and 1580s, to the First Amendment separation of church and state, and how that shaped the American worldview and American perceptions of the wider world. As I said, at the other end of the spectrum, the last chapter deals with Reagan and the end of the Cold War, and I do have an epilogue on George W. Bush and Barack Obama by placing them both in their very different ways, squarely within the history that I've traced in the previous 29 chapters in the book. And yes, Barack Obama is definitely as much of an heir to this tradition of religion and American foreign policy as George W. Bush was, although in some very different ways. By using such a large sweep, I wanted to give a fuller account of the many diverse and often contradictory ways in which religion helped give shape to America's role in the world. Despite their excellence, many scholarly accounts can't help but miss this diversity, episodically focused as they are on a single individual or time period or group. In fact, the central premise of my book is that while religion provided many Americans with a cultural and ideological lens through which to view the world, a mental map, if you will, there was no one single religious influence, but many. And that through an endless series of arguments about America's role in the world, these influences often produced a synthesis that pushed U.S. foreign policy in a highly moralistic direction. For this reason, the book is entitled Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, which comes from the cobbling together of 2 separate phrases in Paul's epistle to the Ephesians on how they should be proper Christians, on what it took to be a proper Christian. And as I said, those the Sword of the Spirit and Shield of Faith don't appear together in Ephesians, but they are in the same chapter and close to each other in the verses, and I've put them together. I use this phrase not only because several American foreign policymakers invoked it to explain themselves, including Woodrow Wilson and John Foster Dulles, or I should say they use Ephesians chapter and verse, but because it conveys the book's core argument that the religious influence has made American foreign relations unusually moralistic, normative, and values-driven, both in terms of war, the sword of the Spirit, and peace, the shield of faith. In terms of conservatism and liberalism, nationalism and internationalism, militarism and pacifism, exceptionalism and cosmopolitanism. So the religious influence was not unidirectional. It wasn't consensual, static, or monolithic. The book has several other themes and arguments that I don't have time to flesh out today. Instead, I'd like to focus on my 2 main approaches in explaining how and why religion has influenced the conduct of American foreign relations. And to put it in very basic terms, I'm going to be looking at sort of a top-down political and diplomatic approach, but then also a bottom-up social approach. Common to both of these is that religion shaped perceptions of the wider world and of America's role in it. And as I said, along the way I'll use specific cases or figures, usually drawn from chapter-length studies by way of example. I'd be happy, if you've had a chance to see the table of contents to the book, I'd be happy to talk about some of the other examples that I use. And of course, I left quite a few out that I'd also be happy to discuss. I had to make choices in doing a book of this length, even of this length. But I'd be there are lots of things that I've left out that I'd also be happy to discuss. The first of my 2 approaches is pretty obvious, so obvious that it might seem banal, but on closer inspection actually becomes crucial. American foreign policy has often been influenced by religion simply because many foreign policymakers themselves have been religious and have given religious faith and ideas a great deal of importance. It's difficult, if not impossible, to speak with any certainty about what people believed because there's ultimately no way of knowing. As historians, the best we can do is examine the manifestations of belief, both private and public, and look for consistencies and regularities between this private and public belief and then policy, or certainly worldviews. And it's also important not just to look for consistencies and regularities, but to look for inconsistencies and irregularities. In other words, did policymakers take religious ideas, observances, and other manifestations of faith seriously? Was their public use of religion consistent with their private faith? Did they make religion a central part of their life? Was it part of their policymaking? The answers are sometimes surprising. For example, I argue that the foreign policies of some of the most personally devout presidents, such as Jimmy Carter, were not as religiously motivated as we might assume. In fact, I make an argument about Jimmy Carter that it was his desire to rigorously separate issues of church and state that caused him and caused his administration to miss some of the developments in world religion and world politics, such as Islamic fundamentalism. Then there were those like Woodrow Wilson or John Foster Dulles, who were clearly religious and whose religion clearly influenced their worldview, but in ways historians have not fully appreciated. Other figures, such as Richard Nixon, professed a great religiosity while almost entirely ignoring it in the making of their foreign policy. And here is an example of inconsistency. While others who are not normally thought of as particularly religious, such as Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, or George Kennan, did regularly turn to religion. So in this sense, my book is an exercise in historical recovery. Revisionism also, but I think a more appropriate word is recovery, for I've come to believe that we've totally misunderstood the religious backgrounds of some key figures and how their religious backgrounds influenced their approach to the world. Take, for example, William McKinley. Everyone knows the story in 1898 when the United States went to war with Spain over Cuba and the Philippines. And by the end of this, what John Hay called this splendid little war, the United States found itself in possession of Manila and by default possession of the entire Filipino archipelago. And nobody in the United States at the time really knew what to do with the Philippines. There were a lot of people who had very strong opinions one way or the other, but in policymaking circles, nobody knew what to do with the Philippines. Even arch-imperialists at the time, people like Teddy Roosevelt and Alfred Thayer Mahan, Henry Cabot Lodge, were against taking all of the Philippines. They simply wanted the port of Manila, the city of Manila, because that was what was strategically important, maybe the island of Luzon, but certainly not the entire Philippines. And when the US negotiators sailed for Paris to negotiate the terms of the peace treaty with Spain, they had no idea what they were going to demand by way of the Philippines, because McKinley had no idea what he wanted yet from the Spanish over the Philippines. And so it was an incredibly fraught, incredibly emotional, already in the fall of 1898, already an incredibly contentious issue. And McKinley infamously explained his decision to annex the entire Philippines, the whole Philippines, and make the United States an old style European colonial power. He explained this decision as divine inspiration. In a meeting with missionary leaders from the Methodist Church, his own church, he said, quote, "I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight. And I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late, it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came. There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died." In 1973, in a major article called Imperialism and Sincerity, a distinguished historian of American foreign relations and international history took McKinley to task for being, well, insincere. And almost all historians of this phase of American imperialism have agreed. According to this view, McKinley wasn't motivated or even informed by religion, but by other factors, be they strategic, political, diplomatic, or economic. In this view, religion wasn't a false consciousness so much as a cynical cloaking device to justify a decision taken for other hard-headed reasons, be they strategic, political, diplomatic, or economic. And those were all certainly important reasons. Anyone looking at the record on American imperialism and the Philippines can't escape these strategic and diplomatic and strategic and economic reasons. But what struck me is that none of these historians, and almost all historians of American imperialism in the Philippines, take this line that religion wasn't important. None of these historians actually looked at McKinley's religious biography. And when we do, it raises some interesting questions. McKinley was raised in an evangelical Methodist household in Antebellum, Ohio. He had an intensely devout evangelical mother to whom he was very close, and for the rest of his life, she was the touchstone for a lot of his views. Later on in life, he recalled that one of his favorite childhood memories was that he loved listening to Methodist circuit riders read their sermons, or speak their sermons extemporaneously. Like many evangelicals, benevolent reform and not the pro-business policies he would later adopt brought him into the Republican Party. As a student, he was president of the YMCA in Canton, Ohio, at a time when, of course, the C in YMCA didn't just mean something, but it meant everything. He fought in the Civil War, including at Antietam. He regularly attended soldiers' prayer meetings. He often led those prayer meetings. He participated in camp revivals. And crucially, he supported emancipation. I wouldn't call him an abolitionist because he wasn't an activist as I think the term abolitionist connotes, but he was in favor of emancipation at a time just before the Civil War and during the Civil War, when pretty much the only people who were advocating emancipation were very religious, and doing so from a religious perspective. After the war, he favored radical Reconstruction and was bitterly critical of the South's treatment of freed slaves. Also after the war, he and his wife Ida were leaders in the temperance movement in Ohio when temperance was almost synonymous with evangelicalism. As a lawyer, he represented miners' unions. This is astonishing for the McKinley we know as president, but as a lawyer, he represented miners' unions, and as a young congressman, he voted for the Bland Free Coinage Bill and the Sherman Silver Purchase Bill. Also as a congressman, he denounced Jim Crow as it was beginning to take root in the 1880s, and he generally supported black rights in the South. In other words, McKinley was a devout evangelical Methodist in an era when evangelical Methodists were passionately devoted to reform, from the antebellum benevolent empire and abolitionism to the social gospel of the progressive era. Methodists were committed to the notion of uplift, a paternalistic, often racist version of uplift, to be sure. But when combined with faith-based ideas about America's virtue and manifest destiny, was a tailor-made ideology for imperialism. McKinley wanted to be a Republican president, and so he moved to the right on issues of race and economics, but in foreign affairs, he could still practice a form of progressive, faith-based social control. So when McKinley got down on his knees and prayed for guidance about the Philippines, about this incredibly difficult decision, was he being insincere? Hardly. He often prayed for guidance when he was trying to make a difficult decision. Indeed, it would have been odd had he not prayed to God for guidance, and it was perfectly natural for him to embark upon a foreign policy grounded in notions of paternalistic Christian uplift. And I argue in the book that this helps us account for the phenomenon of progressive imperialism, an oxymoron to us, but not to McKinley, or to Teddy Roosevelt, or Elihu Root, or Albert Beveridge, or Alfred Thayer Mahan, or Josiah Strong, or any of the progressive imperialists of the late 19th century. I'd also like to consider another example of a key foreign policymaker who I think still is religiously misunderstood, and that's Franklin Roosevelt. FDR isn't normally considered by historians, by journalists, by anybody really looking at him or writing his biography to have been a particularly religious person or a particularly religious president. And when I began writing this book, a friend of mine who has written a lot on FDR's foreign policy said to me, "This sounds like a great book. You're going to do the whole period, the whole sweep of American foreign policy and its relationship with religion. But what are you going to do when you get to FDR and World War II? Because if you write a book like this on foreign policy, you can't ignore World War II. But he said FDR wasn't very religious. So where's the religious aspect going to come in? Where's the religious angle going to come in?" And I told him that I didn't know at this point. I was still stuck in the 18th century at that point. But that I'd cross that bridge when I came to it, and that I hoped there would be a bridge there when I came to it. And luckily for me, there was a bridge. There was a very solid, sturdy bridge that I quite happily and easily crossed. Because nothing could be further from the truth. Franklin Roosevelt as a person and as a president was incredibly religious. And there are religious fingerprints all over his political and diplomatic record. When Franklin Roosevelt was asked early in his presidency to define his philosophy, he said, "Oh, that's easy. I'm a Christian and a Democrat. That's all." And it was clear that he meant that he was a Christian first and a Democrat second. And I discovered this, which is not something that's covered in most of the literature on FDR. A couple of biographies do mention very episodically, or very briefly, I should say, that FDR was religious and what his religious views were, but they don't go into much depth. So how I came across this was when I started reading memoirs of people from the Roosevelt time, from the Roosevelt administration, memoirs of people like Francis Perkins and Jim Farley and Robert Sherwood, and also Eleanor Roosevelt. And in all of these portrayals of people who knew FDR best in their memoirs was the fact that Franklin Roosevelt was religion, and that religion was very central to how he viewed himself and how he viewed America's place in the world. Even Eleanor Roosevelt, who was not a religious person. In fact, I don't think she used the phrase or the term atheist, but I would say, reading Eleanor's views on religion, that it's pretty clear that she was an atheist. At the very least, she was a skeptic or an agnostic, but she was certainly not religion, and she found FDR's faith bewildering and strange and inexplicable, and yet she said it was probably the most powerful force within him. This isn't surprising given FDR's background. He was brought up and had a lifelong devotion. He was brought up in and had a lifelong devotion to the Episcopal Church. And I think it's interesting and certainly very important when we consider Franklin Roosevelt to remember that the Episcopal Church had a very strong social gospel tradition. It was Episcopalians founded some of the most radical organizations of the social gospel movement, the Church League for Industrial Democracy and others. Was very involved in the women's movement and in the suffrage movement. But it also had a very strong tradition of noblesse oblige, that people of FDR's patrician background, people from the Episcopal Church, should give back to the community. It's also important to remember the Episcopal Church's non-sectarian, ecumenical, and I would say even anti-theological view of religion. And as scholars such as Mark Silk have shown, it's no coincidence that the Judeo-Christian tradition was invented in the era of Franklin Roosevelt. But the public record is also pretty clear, in addition to his private faith. And we see these ideas in his use of religion in responding to the world crisis and to American isolationism in 1937-1941. The main challenge, of course, was how to convince Americans that they had to take a more active role in resisting Nazism. It's pretty clear that by 1937, FDR himself was committed to inching the United States into a much greater activist role in resisting the rise of Nazism, especially in Germany, but also militarism in Japan. But his challenge was how do you do this when the vast majority of Americans, even those who weren't America Firsters or going to listen to Lindbergh speeches, were steadfastly opposed to intervention. And in trying to explain to Americans why they had to take a greater role in world politics, he turned to religion. For example, in his 1939 State of the Union address. So these aren't just speeches to religious audiences. This isn't just when FDR was going to speak to the Federal Council of Churches or the Knights of Columbus or other religious organizations. In his 1939 State of the Union address, he said that 3 great institutions of humanity were at risk: religion, democracy, and international goodwill. And he ranked them in that order, with religion first, because he said religion was the source of the human conscience. Religion was the source of the freedom of conscience. Because of that, and also religion was the source of virtue. Because of that, religion was the source of democracy. And democracy, in turn, was the source of international goodwill. So without religion, you couldn't have democracy. Without democracy, you couldn't have world peace. And it's very explicit and very clear at the start of his 1939 State of the Union address. I don't think FDR knew that he was tapping into a very old tradition of what we now call democratic peace theory. This goes back to Montesquieu and the Spirit of the Law, where he says that republics don't go to war with one another because republics are inherently peaceful. This is also, of course, common in the writings of Kant. It was also something that Madison picked up in the 1790s, and he came up with a formulation before Kant of what we, as I said, now call democratic peace, that democracies don't go to war with one another. An interesting difference between, and FDR is in this tradition, although he doesn't talk about Montesquieu, and he doesn't talk about Kant in his 1939 State of the Union or elsewhere. The difference between Montesquieu and Kant and the European tradition of democratic peace and the American tradition of democratic peace is that in the European tradition, in Montesquieu, Kant, and elsewhere, religion is not a factor. Religion is not in this logical chain that helps explain world peace. It's only, as far as I've been able to tell, it's only in American thinking about the democratic peace, in some of the writings by people like Madison, and also in in speeches by people like Franklin Roosevelt, that we see religion take such a front and center role. The other most famous example of FDR employing religion to explain why America was at risk and also what America would be fighting for if it did get more involved in the world crisis was, of course, his 1941 State of the Union address, in which he outlined his 4 freedoms, the second of which is freedom of worship. And in between 1937, indeed, in 1941 and after 1941, in countless other speeches, FDR framed World War II as a clash between religion and irreligion, between faith and atheism. For example, in his October 1941 Navy Day address, which was probably up to that point, this is October 41, 2 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States wasn't yet officially at war, although it was in a shooting war with the Nazis in the North Atlantic and had been for some time. His October 1941 Navy Day address was by far the most explicitly bellicose and anti-German speech yet. And in it, in one of the lines that was repeated often in the press, Roosevelt alleged that Hitler had, quote, a secret plan to abolish all existing religions, Catholic, Protestant, Mohammedan, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jewish alike, and replace them with an international Nazi church. Mein Kampf would replace the Bible and be enforced as Holy Writ, while the swastika would replace the cross. FDR even contemplated an alliance of world religious leaders to combat the forces of irreligion. So his idea before the United States actually was a belligerent, was a participant in the war in 1940, was to gather world religious leaders in Washington to form a common front of faith, no matter what faith, against the atheism or the paganism or whatever you wanted to call it of the Nazi threat. And he even told Adolf Berle, one of his closest aides, especially on international relations issues, he asked Adolf Berle to sort of make it happen. And Berle, who was also a point man not just on foreign policy, but one of FDR's point men on religion and spoke a lot to religious organizations in the United States, had no idea how to pull this off. He was completely perplexed and bewildered with how to make this happen. So he did what anybody in his position and anyone with his access in Washington would do, and he turned to the people who he thought could help him. And so he went to the foreign embassies of countries that had foreign religions to the United States. So he paid a visit to the Turkish embassy in Washington, and he told the Turkish ambassador to the United States about FDR's plan to have a gathering of world religious leaders. And there was this awkward moment where the Turkish ambassador sort of dissembled and stumbled and then finally said, but Mr. Berle, you'll have to tell your president that there's no way. And of course, Berle wanted the Turkish ambassador to tell him who the top Muslim was who could come over and represent the Muslim world in Washington in this World Religious Summit. And Berle said, I'm sorry, but there's no way that my government will agree to do this because we have a very strict constitutional separation of church and state. And Berle said, yes, of course you do, of course you do. And as a matter of fact, so do we. And nothing came of the idea. Moreover, Roosevelt's framing of the war as one between peoples of faith and a totalitarian system opposed to faith had an ironic afterlife when Harry Truman used it to call for a crusade against Soviet communism in the Cold War. Truman used exactly the same rhetoric that FDR used when speaking about the Nazis to discuss the Soviet Union. In fact, he simply swapped Soviet or communist for Nazi, and otherwise his speeches, some of his speeches, read almost identically to those of Franklin Roosevelt. Truman even tried to host a summit of his own of world religious leaders in 1948. And he asked Myron Taylor, his point man on religion and religious organizations, to make it happen. And Taylor talked to the Vatican, and he started talking to other religious leaders. Truman boasted about bringing over the Dalai Lama and all leaders of world faith to Washington to have an anti-communist summit. This time, the idea for a world religious summit was vetoed or was nixed not by the Turkish ambassador, but by liberal Protestants. Well, Protestants of all stripe, but especially liberal Protestants, mainline Protestant leaders who were adamantly opposed to cooperating with the Vatican on church-state separation grounds, but also on the grounds that they saw the Vatican as being particularly bellicose in its rhetoric towards the Soviet Union as a cause of the Cold War. So Truman himself also tried to have a summit of world religious leaders, but wasn't able to. The second approach I take to explaining the prevalence of religion in American foreign policy making is more social rather than political. It's bottom-up as opposed to top-down. And it's to look at the influence non-elite religious communities had on foreign relations. These are the people far removed from policymaking. If anyone doing diplomatic history can't avoid looking at elites, can't avoid a political or diplomatic approach, because these are the people who make foreign policy. And yet I argue in the book that these people far removed from foreign policy making, far removed from the corridors of power and actual decision making, also had an influence. I explain why these people could have any influence at all for reasons that were more structural in nature, that were actually a combination of two factors: democracy and domestic politics, especially the decentralized nature of the American political system, and free security. And I can talk more about those in the discussion period afterwards. But in essence, policymakers had to take religion seriously, even when they didn't want to, because of domestic politics and free security. They couldn't ignore these groups of people, religious groups of people, who were ever present, morally driven, averse to compromise, highly activist, politically connected, and deeply concerned with the wider world. I point out something that to me is a truism in the book, that religious communities are inherently transnational communities. They inherently have a transnational and internationalist worldview because they're deeply concerned with the fate of their co-religionists in other countries. This was obviously true for a long time for Catholic and Jewish immigrant communities, but it's also been true of Protestant Americans, including old stock Protestants who weren't recent immigrants with ties, with immediate personal ties to family and friends overseas. Protestants, American Protestants, liberal or conservative, have also been, up to the present day, very concerned with the fate of Protestants in other countries. Examples of this bottom-up social influence abound, from evangelical and Unitarian abolitionists opposed to expansionism before the Civil War, to ecumenical Protestants being the early cheerleaders for collective security and international organization in the first half of the 20th century. In fact, I make the argument that the idea of a United Nations didn't entirely originate, but in large part originated with the ecumenical movement, to champions of Soviet Jews and Christians undermining détente in the 1970s. But I'd like to outline one example in particular in greater detail to explain this bottom-up influence on religious influence on foreign policymaking. And that's missionaries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The non-missions historiography almost universally portrays missionaries as aggressive agents of political and military imperialism, and at the very least of cultural imperialism and hegemony. And this is especially true for the diplomatic and international history literature, which portrays missionaries as self-righteous, hardcore imperialists, missionaries as the tip of the imperial spear, which is both true and untrue. It's true in the sense that a lot of them were nasty, hardcore imperialists, or at the very least, overt, avowed, explicit cultural imperialists. But once I got into mission records, missionary records, and their letters back home, I was actually surprised how often missionaries were critics of American empire and critics of American power. If for no other reason than American imperialism was a source of prostitution, sexually transmitted diseases, gambling, alcoholism, and a number of other social ills. But I was struck by how often missionaries criticized U.S. Colonial officials or government officials or military officials for their treatment of local populations. Instead, I see missionaries as imperialists of a different kind, and my chapter on late 19th century imperialists is called The Imperialism of Human Rights, which is a phrase Eric Hobsbawm used a few years ago to refer to human rights groups and NGOs operating in the 1990s and the early part of this century. And here I'm informed by the new historiography of missions and of imperialism, especially British missions and British imperialism, which portrays missionaries as agents of cultural exchange and cultural transfer, as much as imposers of cultural imperialism. Missionaries certainly were cultural imperialists, but from the 19th century on, they practiced a kind of informal, often inadvertent imperialism of introducing and then spreading a universal value upon peoples who had never heard of it. That's why I use universal in quotation marks. To spread universal values among peoples who had never heard of this universal value, let alone its universal applicability. Common examples are the China missionaries who have such a terrible reputation in the late 19th and early 20th century. But we forget that these missionaries placed more emphasis on social and political causes than on conversion. Their main causes were anti-opium and anti-foot-binding crusades, building schools for girls, building medical clinics. I found one example in a missionary newspaper or periodical that used the phrase human rights, or used the language of human rights to discuss the situation of wealthy Chinese women who were not allowed to be educated and had to live an indolent, luxurious lifestyle befitting of their station. And they said this is a violation of the dignity of the individual, which is initially a very Christian idea that has become secularized in the last 30 or 40 years. But they said this violates the dignity of these women's individuality. It violates their inherent rights as a person. It violates their human rights. As these missionaries did so, as they educated people, as they went on these anti-foot-binding crusades, they aroused local anger. And they lashed out at missionaries and destroyed their chapels and destroyed their medical clinics. And you can understand why. These missionaries were coming in and bringing in outside values that they were calling universal, but that Chinese people in the interior or anywhere didn't know were these universal values. Instead, what they saw were these universal values completely erasing and obliterating centuries of local tradition and local culture. And so they lashed out at missionaries. And when local populations did, these missionaries appealed to Washington and often to London as well for help. And usually Washington and London came to their assistance, either with overt gunboat diplomacy or through diplomatic pressure. A better way to explain this is by using two lesser-known examples of missionary groups who brought their pressure to bear on U.S. foreign policy. The first example I'd like to use is the case of Mormon missionaries in Europe in the late 19th century, in the 1890s and early 20th century. This is a time, of course, when Mormons had only recently come to terms with American society at large, and certainly with the U.S. government. The passage of congressional legislation and Supreme Court decisions upholding that legislation, basically banning certain Mormon practices, was only a few decades old. This is when Mormonism is still controversial in American politics. It certainly wasn't uncontroversial at this point. And of course, being a Mormon means going on mission, going abroad, and proselytizing. And missionaries were going, Mormon missionaries, that is, were going not only to Africa and other places, but we're also, as they do now, we're going to Europe. And when they went to Europe, when they went to Paris or to Copenhagen or to Frankfurt or Berlin, they would often get harassed by local officials, by local police, by the local municipal officials. They would get thrown in jail. They would get sort of driven out of town. And when they did so, when this happened, these Mormon missionaries did what any U.S. citizen abroad would do in that situation. They turned to their local consulate or their local embassy for help and said, I'm an American citizen abroad, and I've just been thrown in jail, or I've just been harassed, or I've just been persecuted. And the diplomats, the American diplomats at these stations in Europe, had no idea what to do with these Mormon missionaries. They were not sympathetic to them. As I said, that's what, this is a time when Mormonism still wasn't it wasn't at all accepted in mainstream American society, especially to an elite diplomatic corps that wasn't sympathetic to religion in general. Almost all American, or very few American diplomats were sympathetic to Protestant missionaries in China, let alone Mormon missionaries in Paris or in Berlin. So these diplomats had no idea what to do with these Mormon missionaries. And then the diplomats did what any diplomat does in that situation when they don't know what to do, and they wrote back to Washington for advice. And the State Department thought about it And the State Department at first was perplexed. And then in a note from John Hay, wrote back to the consulates and said, from the facts we can tell, it looks like these Mormons are simply being persecuted for preaching their faith. And not for anything else. They're not breaking any local laws, or certainly they're not breaking any local laws that we would consider to be just laws. They're not stealing, they're not assaulting anyone, they're not undermining the government, they're simply preaching their faith. And every human being has a right to freedom of religion. They have a right to preach their faith, and they have a right to practice their faith. And so in a very strongly worded note from John Hay to all U.S. diplomatic posts in the world, but especially to European countries, drawing attention to the plight of Mormons in Europe, John Hay, the Secretary of State, said, these Mormons deserve the full protection of the U.S. government, and we have to protect them. And he said we have to protect them in the name of this universal right, this universal this universal right to freedom of religion. So here we have a clear case of the U.S. government bringing a significant amount of pressure, of economic and diplomatic and cultural pressure and political pressure on sovereign foreign governments to respect a right that the Americans are calling universal, that these countries don't consider to be a universal right. A lot of times these Mormon missionaries were preaching in countries that didn't have a separation of church and state. They didn't recognize religious liberty as Americans recognized it, that had established churches, that said, no, you can't just preach Mormonism, you can't just preach free conversion to another faith that's not Lutheran or Catholic or anything else. And yet after receiving this pressure from the State Department, these European countries backed down. And I find this case to be incredibly interesting because here we're not dealing with a country like China that's semi-colonized and that's being oppressed by Western powers and that's sort of a victim of Western or American imperialism. Here we have the United States spreading universal values in the name of religious freedom on behalf of these Mormon missionaries to its fellow Western nations, to its fellow imperial powers. And without exception, these European countries backed down and stopped harassing Mormon missionaries. There's also the case of Methodist missionaries in South America, these Protestant missionaries who went to South America, where there clearly was no freedom of religion as the United States understood it, where there was no church-state separation, where Protestants were, any Protestant, let alone a foreign Protestant, was prohibited from presiding over funerals and marriages and things like that. And these Methodist missionaries, initially a group from Chicago, brought a significant amount of pressure to bear on McKinley and Roosevelt administrations to get these Latin American republics to change their ways, and in some cases, in the case of Peru and Bolivia, to change local law to allow for this universal right to religious freedom to be practiced. This is, of course, certainly a form of cultural imperialism. This is a case of an outsider coming in and imposing its values, in this case religious liberty, at the expense of local traditions and customs. It's clearly a kind of cultural imperialism. But I argue it's a kind we easily recognize today in the activities of human rights NGOs. Crucially, when these missionaries were resisted, sometimes violently, in China, Europe, and in South America, and when they called upon the US government for protection, they were not just protecting their own physical safety, but were promoting three ideas, what I think were revolutionary ideas in the context of America's globalist turn in the early 20th century, and that became the basis of America's informal imperialism and system of regulatory world order following World War II. What one historian who's here in this room, it's the first time she's been in this room when I've used this in a talk, what one historian has called a New Deal for the world. These three ideas were first, that certain values were universal and should be exported globally and protected with armed force if necessary. Second, that these individual freedoms should form the normative basis of international relations, to be enhanced and protected by international organizations. And third, that America's values and the world's values were one and the same. I'd like to conclude with just a few general remarks. Religion doesn't explain everything in the history of American foreign relations. It may not even explain most things. Many episodes in American diplomatic history, even very broadly defined, had little to do with religion, and not all US foreign policymakers themselves were religious. But religion was a factor much more often than we realized or acknowledged. And by looking for these missing pieces of a puzzle, we get a better sense of what American foreign relations actually has looked like. Thank you.